You're live.
Hello, my name is Elizabeth Bice. I'm the Federal Treasurer of Socialist Action, a steering committee member of the NDP Socialist Caucus, and the past Secretary of the Toronto and York Region Labour Council, and a retired member of the Canadian Union of Postal Workers. We acknowledge that we are hosting this event on Indigenous lands, including the unceded territories of the Mississaugas of the New Credit, the Wendat, and Haudenosaunee people. We join in the fight for justice, recognizing that there can be no real reconciliation without restitution. That entails seizing the assets of the big resource corporations and returning them to the commons. Tonight's webcast is titled For Free Post-Secondary Education with Emily Steers, a graduate student in music at Wilfrid Laurier University in Waterloo, Ontario, plus Samantha Richards in Hamilton and Dick Fast in Toronto, and I will be hosting the show. Unfortunately, the Ontario rep of the Canadian Federation of Students is unable to participate tonight due to a late conflict in schedule. Emily will lead off the discussion with a talk for about 20 minutes, followed by Samantha and Nick, who will speak for about 10 minutes each. Then we will take a few questions from the online audience. Audience members can submit a question by accessing the webcast directly from YouTube and by typing the questions directly onto the chat column. Please direct your question to a specific person if you wish, or all three can answer if they wish. If you like this webcast, please subscribe to the Socialist Action YouTube channel. If you agree with what you hear during this program, please join Socialist Action by signing up at our website, www.socialistaction.ca, or by calling 647-986-1917. That's 647-986-1917. So, let's begin. Comrade Emily Steers is a music grad student, a member of the Public Service Alliance of Canada that represents teaching assistants at the Wilfrid Laurier University, a union local that she helped to organize last fall. Emily is a member of the cross-country leadership of Socialist Action. Welcome, Emily.
Hello, all. It's good to see you all and great to be back. So, as I say, my name is Emily Steers. I'm just finished my graduate studies at Wilfrid Laurier University, and I'm coming to you from Mississaugas and Anishinaabe land. So, the case for post-secondary education has never been more pressing. In an age where the spread of disinformation and conspiracy theories run rampant, it is all the more imperative to make knowledge publicly accessible and publicly available. It's also a time of great economic uncertainty. As the pandemic has devastated so many people and caused mass unemployment and a tremendous recession all around the world, universities, meanwhile, are taking this opportunity to raise tuition. In fact, my alma mater, Mount Allison University, has taken the opportunity to raise tuition by 4.5% across the board, which brings tuition for full-time students to almost $10,000 per year. A recent article from The Coast, based in Halifax, has highlighted how precarious student well-being is, particularly right now. In 2016, they found that between 30 and 50% of all university students across Canada had experienced food insecurity, which is far above the 10 to 12% of the national average. This has only been exacerbated by the pandemic, when people are being forced to self-isolate and have less wages to draw on and more precarious work. Education should not come at the cost of students' health, mental well-being, physical well-being. It is not only the students who are struggling with these financial hardships brought on by the model of for-profit education that we are currently relying upon. Teachers and researchers are also massively disadvantaged. Adjunct and part-time professor jobs are replacing stable tenured positions, and that which pay only a lump sum per course, no guaranteed salary, no benefits, no stability. These jobs are required to reapply every year. This results in far less time being spent actually educating students and far less time actually generating research to benefit our body of knowledge. Meanwhile, all of this is done with the looming threat of publish or perish and the relentless academic grind hanging overhead. The for-profit model of education treats education like a business. The education is the product that the universities are selling to the customer base of university students. And the professors are a means to an end, a middleman that you would try to reduce the cost as much as possible in order to maximize your profit margin. This is a relatively new model of education. In previous decades, previous generations, education was seen as, well, education was a hobby for the rich, but it has become more and more and more accessible. And the pursuit of knowledge is something that we should all be striving for. However, there are advantages to keeping student populaces at a disadvantage, weakened and downturned and neutered politically. Students are powerful organizing advocates, as is demonstrated by our amazing colleagues at the Canadian Federation of Students, who unfortunately can't be here today. They have campaigns about mental health care access, addressing sexualized and gender-based violence, reconciliation with Indigenous people, transgender healthcare access, caps on raising tuition, equity for international students, ending the ban on homosexual blood donations, and so much more. There are so many powerful student-led campaigns on every single possible issue around the country. Students being impoverished or lacking access to resources and being kept unstable by increasing tuition costs, increasing costs of living while not getting any support is a way to neuter this very powerful political body. As we've seen with the recent Ford cuts, there are many students who were forced to drop out of university after last year's rollout of cuts to OSAP, and though the nominal decrease in tuition by 10%, often that just resulted in more ancillary fees being piled on top of students by the university bodies. Socialist Action has long advocated for free higher education, and recently a fantastic platform by our comrade Daniel Terade has been put forth about nationalizing and putting into public ownership the scientific publishing process. Why should we be locked out behind paywalls for knowledge and research that is being publicly funded by Canadian tax dollars and global tax money? Why should we not then be able to access that information? Why is it being held for ransom for massive profit by publication companies? Now more than ever, education and knowledge should be free. And this isn't some pie-in-the-sky, ridiculous dream. We know it's possible. Belgium, Austria, Germany, Norway, Sweden, Finland, all of these countries have free public higher education, not only for students from those countries, but for all EU member states. And for some of them, anyone who can speak the language can access free higher education. So how is this possible? It's pretty straightforward. Tax the rich. We close tax loopholes, expropriate the funds in offshore bank accounts, close the tax loopholes that allow businesses such as Amazon to make $97 billion in profit while not paying a cent of tax on valuable necessities. All of this and more is possible if we have the courage and the determination and the organization to seize it.
Okay. Are you finished? I guess so. Okay. So our next speaker is Samantha Richards. She worked for the Ryerson University Students Union and currently for CUPE Local 3902, the union that represents teaching assistants at U of Toronto, operating from her home base in Hamilton. Welcome, SA comrade Samantha. Unmute yourself, Samantha.
Thank you. I do want to just do a quick correction. I actually work for CUPE Local 1281, and CUPE 3902 is actually a local that we organize the staff that work there, which is a interesting connection to that error. But thanks for having me. And I just wanted to speak to my experiences as someone who is worked in the university sector, who has been a student at multiple universities, and it now helps 1281 organize workers on university campuses across on mainland Ontario, but in other provinces as well. My first experience with student organizing was with the Ryerson Students Union. I was a student there and was involved in some activist items. And my first event that I attended was the All Out February 1st rally and action, which involves students from GTA colleges and universities marching to Queen's Park to protest tuition fee raises, raises that, as if I've learned through the Canadian Federation of Students, because they're great activists on behalf of students. I have learned through them that things such as how college tuition has outgrown inflation by 435% over the last 20 years. And for university undergrads, that number is 601%. And that's quite absurd and completely unsustainable and inaccessible. So that's how I got involved and how I got to learn how important free education is, and how we need to work for it and build solidarity across university campuses to make this something that we can attain together. Unfortunately, as a student, I did start to see conservative trends and in student unions, and they're always put under the guise of choice and fiscal responsibility, when the quality of services and education that students can access falls greatly when things like this happen. Through my levels of experience with the universities and their unions, I've seen lockouts of staff from supposedly progressive student employers, defunding important equity groups on campuses that made the experiences on campuses better for marginalized students. Plus, we just experienced the Student Choice Initiative, which was a legislation put forth by the Ford government that didn't talk to student unions or the members of those student unions, except for a choice few that were all seen to have connections to the Ford government in some ways. But it withheld funds from student unions that offer essential services that, beyond the education, help to support the experience on campus, such as health services, food banks, services for LGBTQ plus students, for Indigenous students. And these are all part of the educational experience, and they're all required. So when you're cutting the funds, these are the services that, like, when you're cutting these funds, these are the services that suffer, and the universities are underfunded by the provincial and federal government to begin with. Outside of that, currently, I'm a student at McMaster, and unfortunately, they are not a member of the Canadian Federation of Students. They voted to leave in the 90s, but they also have this conservative feeling on campus where they just recently tried to defund their OPIRG. OPIRG stands for Ontario Public Interest Research Group, and these are the places that focus their research on things that are going to help community and help students. And without those services, everything on campus is going to become negative, or not like become negative, but just be negatively impacted is how I should have phrased that. Currently, I am an employee of QP 1281. As I mentioned, we organize workers on campuses. So I still have my ear to the ground and I'm able to see what's happening because in our view, the students and workers, their struggle is connected, and it's an important symbol of solidarity. And because most students are workers, and when tuition is rising exponentially every year outside of inflation, outside of cost of living adjustments, this makes students who have to be workers as well, it cuts off their access to education as well. Not everyone has the privilege to not work while in school. And making education free would make like time more accessible to these students because they wouldn't have such a financial burden on their shoulders. Personally, I've had to step back from education because I had to focus on work and on making money, on feeding into this system. And it's very discouraging. And that can also make students not want to strive to go to school. And all of this negatively affects these communities. And when you go farther, you see it has the greater effect on these social structures and how marginalized communities are even further pushed away because they were already in a situation where things like this were inaccessible to them. CFS is a great student group because they're activist based and they need to be, because some of these issues aren't just black and white and they have such lobbying power, and we're getting more movements such as even this academic year, in spite of COVID stuff, we still have students organizing in support of the students that are constantly pushed out of these academic circles and situations. And most of the time it's because of financial issues. We had the All Out September 30th in support of Indigenous Black students and faculty and staff. And on top of that, you have a whole subsection that I haven't even talked about, but that Emily brought up, was international students. International student fees, while I explained the percentages before, that's for domestic students. For international students, it's even higher. And you see these universities, I literally saw quotes being like, they're worried about losing revenue from their international students because international students aren't able to enroll. And because of the pandemic situation that has thrown everything into disarray because these sectors aren't prepared for it, the situation is completely different for them. But to have to rely on that high price for these students and claim that education isn't going to be changing this year, it's not, it can't be true. Switching everything to online learning, even as a student now, it's not accessible for everyone. You have the issues of like internet, you have the issues of tech, but you even have to consider learning styles. And it's just not fair to expect students to pay this full price for half of the quality of education. And it's not fair to any student group. And like I said, it's just at this point in time, we're at a moment where solidarity is just essential. We're at a moment that we can use as a catalyst for change. And I think the time is now.
Okay. Thank you, Samantha. The next speaker is Nick Fast. He is a PhD student at U of Toronto, studying Canadian left and labor history. Nick is a member of Socialist Action, originally from Vancouver. Welcome, Nick.
Thank you. Thank you. So, good evening, comrades, or good afternoon for those on the West Coast. Thank you all for joining us this evening. It is no secret that post-secondary education is becoming an essential part of entering the workforce. We are told that, quote, to get a good job, we need to have some accreditation to our name, whether that be in the form of a bachelor degree, a Red Seal certificate, or an apprentice trade ticket. However, post-secondary education is becoming a near impossible financial burden for many across Canada and the world. I want to share some brief anecdotes before exploring two related trends in rising tuition prices as why tuition must be free now. As a graduate student teaching assistant spanning the last 4 years in Canada's two most expensive cities, Vancouver and Toronto, I often ask my students at the beginning of the semester about their circumstances that are not always clear in the classroom. In a room of about 20 to 25 students, I ask how many of them hold a job outside of the classroom. To this, most of them, excluding some international students who cannot work under student visa restrictions, put their hands up. My subsequent question asks about the number of hours they need to work during the week. I start with 10 or more, to which all students generally raise their hands. Then 15, and maybe a few hand drop. Then I go to 20, and maybe a few more drop. Then I ask 25, and despite some hands dropping, more than half of the class will have their hands up. Depending on the room, I will go from 25 to 30, 35, and even 40, but a significant minority of students will still have their hands up. Without pressing further, the underlying assumption is that students need to commit at least 3 full days of work to afford 3 to 4 full days of classes. These two commitments are not including their own potential familial commitments or commitments outside of academia and work. The case is even murkier for graduate students like myself. A graduate program requires a time commitment that does not allow us to hold down outside work. Although most institutions offer a funding program to help students sustain themselves, graduate students are still charged tuition that is deducted from the funding package. If I took what was left of my funding package and divided that by 40 hours a week over 52 weeks a year for a total of 280 hours, my hourly wage, once tuition is pulled out, comes to $9.22, far below the provincial minimum wage. Many programs ask their students to apply for large external grants from the Government of Canada, valued at over $20,000 per year from anywhere from 1 to 4 years, as a way to increase funding. However, what my program, among many others, do not tell their students is that they will reduce the university funding by the same amount as the scholarship awarded, effectively resulting in no gain for the student. One of the most common ways for students to handle the rising cost of tuition is to take on student loans. As of 2017, Canadian students owed all levels of government over $28 billion. But once the individual starts earning more than $25,000 a year, the federal government starts charging interest. Further, if an individual has student loan or student debt to their name, pulling out loans for other purchases required to keep capitalism moving, such as mortgages or car loans, are harder to do. The real travesty of the situation is that while some provincial governments are scrapping the interest on provincial loans, the federal government has yet to remove interest from their student loan programs while providing interest-free loans to major corporations such as Bombardier or Air Canada. I suggest that there are two related patterns that have led to unaffordable tuition and the need for free tuition. First, the capitalist class value system on perceived skill. It is no mistake that the jobs that pay higher wages or salaries are often buried behind qualifications that require post-secondary education. Unfortunately, skill, an arbitrary category invented by the bourgeois elite to justify placing more value on jobs that benefit profit making, more than jobs that are required to sustain life. I have yet to see a CEO go an undercover boss who do not require some sort of training from the employee to do their job. Second, and the crucial part, as alluded to earlier by the other two contributors, comrades, is the increased privatization of the university. Transition from a service model that delivers education to a for-profit business model is no secret. For example, on page 3 of the University of Toronto's financial report for 2020, a PDF file readily available through Google search of the document's name, shows that during the 2019 fiscal year, the University of Toronto reported a profit of $441 million. Over the last 10 years, student fees have played an increasing role in that revenue. Whereas in 2010, student fees, which means tuition and other fees, contributed to 31.7% of the university's $2.2 billion in revenue. However, in 2020, that number jumped to exactly 50% of the university's $3.6 billion in revenue. The university continues to blame the provincial government for capping increases in tuition at 4% per year, so make of that what you will. The results of these two patterns creates a system that benefits a wealthy capitalist class by marketing higher wage jobs as requiring more skill and credentials, but simultaneously making those certifications more expensive ensures that only a capitalist class and their dependents can afford to go to post-secondary education. Comrades, I could spend the rest of my evening spewing numbers and statistics from different studies that point towards the benefits of having no-cost post-secondary education. But the argument I want to make tonight is one based on morals and ethics. Most agree that education is a fundamental human right, and yet, like so many other things that we consider human rights, undemocratic financial barriers are placed upon those who are not counted among the capitalists. I wonder how many people are dedicated enough to go to post-secondary education are unable to because of financial burdens. I wonder if the person to solve global warming, cure cancer, or invent a new sustainable green energy source is unable to attend post-secondary because of financial barriers. It would be inaccurate to say the time has come for free education. That moment has long passed. It is morally objectionable that education, something so foundational to the well-being of our society, has such a steep, life-altering price tag. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Nick. Okay, so now we will go to the help of our technical producer, Kurt Young. We'll air some questions from our audience, and he will put it in the chat column, and he will also read the questions, and we will do 3 at a time. So please, yesterday in the chat now, I do believe. So the lineup, you will get up to 8 minutes to answer 1, 2, or 3 questions. And the lineup will be Samantha will speak first, then Nick, and then Emily. So the first, Kurt will also read the questions, even though you have them in the chat. So Kurt?
Okay, so just to let our audience know, we will be going by first come, first serve, but also all questions will be based on new speakers, so we won't be repeating, each, if you ask multiple questions, we'll pass over your question to go to a unique speaker, and then we'll go back to your questions in the future as we go on to further rounds. So the first question is by Barry Weisletter. He asks, why is there plenty of federal money for pipelines and fighter jets, but not for free post-secondary education? What will it take to put priorities correctly in this country? JPL asks, the pursuit of knowledge should be the real goal of university. Why the knowledge only to prepare students to feed the capitalist system? And Dustin Brown asks, my university raised tuition for international students by 10 to 15% for this school year. There was little word about it. How can we expand the public imagination and raise societal expectations?
Okay, you've heard the 3 questions. So Samantha, you're first. You have up to 8 minutes if you need it.
My apologies. To touch on Barry's question, I believe it's simply that none of the major political parties have these types of needs as a priority, which is really unfortunate. It's all currently about upholding a status quo and pandering to the people with the most money, and those are usually the folks that are very conservative. They're willing to sacrifice their focuses of reconciliation, which is making education more accessible to Indigenous communities, yet they want to pay. They want to pay for these pipelines, and what is the reason? The bottom line is profit. They don't. They see it as spending money on students isn't going to make them money right now, instead of investing in a pipeline, which is obviously incorrect, because we know that investing in education has so much long-term benefits in preparing people for good paying jobs and stuff like that. So I just think it's just a lack of a party that's actually willing to dedicate themselves to radical change.
Okay. Nick, you're next. You can answer 1, 2, or 3 questions.
Thank you. I think I can maybe provide some answers for all three. I think as Sam alluded to, Barry, to get to your question first, is the idea that, it's about priorities, really, is at the end of the day. And I think political parties in this parliamentary democracy are focused more on making, like, essentially pleasing voters who are making profit on these systems of exploitation. So it's easier to justify saying I'm going to invest, spend $1 billion on a pipeline or $4 billion on a pipeline, but not take $4 billion and provide, free post-secondary education, because at the end, that's a harder sell to the voter base, right? The Liberal Party is, some people to say it's a center party, but really it's a center right at best party, and they're pandering to their voter base and their support base. I think it's to set the priorities correctly. I think there has to be something on two evolutions have to take place. First is increased student involvement in politics, and I think, as Sam alluded to, how important in her speech, how powerful a student body is, and how active students are, and how they really see the world around them, and want to bring about positive change, but are constantly handcuffed because of exploitation and forces that have yet to be shown that are not beyond their control, that appear to be beyond their control. I think Rick Mercer at the 2015 federal election had mentioned that if students really want to be involved in or have issues brought to them, they have to go out and vote. At the very minimum, they have to go out and vote, because these political parties are reviewing the data about who's voting for them. And if one party sees that, let's say the NDP, willingly they move over, if they see students voting 50% of their support base, they're going to start, using students as leverage. JPL, to get to your question, is the pursuit of knowledge should be dual goal of the university. I think honestly, it's a system that tries to sustain itself. If the capitalist economy requires a profit-making model, and I think universities have realized how profitable education is if you sell it. Basically, we've been marketed to the same way that we are marketed to other products like Coca-Cola or Ford trucks or any consumer goods. Education has been conceived of as the same way. We've gone from a moment of, as you mentioned, like education is like the pursuit of knowledge should be the goal of the university, but the university is looking to make a profit. And just take a look at the board of governors on all the universities, and you'll see where their interests lie. Most of them are, lawyers or heavy capitalists. And Dustin, your point about 10 to 15%, this is a huge or a significant problem. And universities have realized that they can get away with charging astronomical amounts of tuition for international students, and they actively set aside parts of their budget to send recruiters all over the world to market their space, to market their universities, because they know that they can turn such a high profit. In terms of expanding to capture the public imagination, is, I argue, through direct action. It's through being visible and being active participants in the school or the society that you are a part of. And also, I think there has to be some movement from the labor movement as well, because many of these positions that people are, many jobs end up being union jobs, and they're getting students from university who have gone through this. So I think it's a matter of direct action. And I think George Lakey sort of sets out a very important message that essentially direct action and being visible is the best way to at least have your campaign noticed and to bring issues to the surface to be discussed.
Okay. Thank you, Nick. Okay, Emily?
Thanks, all. And I just want to commend my co-presenters on excellent job answering all the questions so far. I have many thoughts. And to Barry's question, I absolutely agree. You know, there's plenty of money for pipelines and fighter jets because that is the priority. That is what the government has decided is the most profitable, is the most important. The value in sending oil to export and destabilizing other countries is more valuable than investing in its people. Solutions, there are so many complicated things. There needs to be a massive reprioritization, as my fellow presenters have said, and especially important to change the way lobbying happens in government, getting the money out of government. And there has been some progress towards that, but not nearly enough for my liking, and not nearly enough to make significant change in the way politics works. So there needs to be direct action, there needs to be mobilization. And I think fundamentally, people are starting to ask the question now that we're experiencing this time of upheaval and change. People are saying, you know, well, okay, suddenly there is a magic money tree that we can shake and the money falls out for, you know, interest-free loans to businesses and to business landlords, but not for the common people. Why is this? There are a lot of people who are starting to wake up and demand better, saying, you know, if you can just pull this money out of thin air when the situation warrants it, and it is warranted, why is that not available for everyday people? And so capitalizing or making use of this energy, this moment in history where people are starting to wake up, more and more people are becoming radicalized by the current moment, by the current political climate, by the current situation. Turning that energy, turning that upset, that dissatisfaction towards questions of, okay, well, why are we funding this? Why are we using our money this way when we could be channeling it into things that will actually actively be for the public good? The question of the pursuit of knowledge, I find really interesting. Sam, you mentioned something about, keeping Indigenous knowledge away from people and denying people access. A friend of mine recently talked about, she's saying, I want to study Indigenous history. I want to learn my language. I want to learn my history. I want to learn these ancestral teachings. And I can't afford it. And I'm not eligible for scholarships to be able to do that. So why is a predominantly white institution, a colonial institution, holding on to my ancestral knowledge that I then have to pay to access? It's absolutely ridiculous. And it's further confirmation of the absolute necessity of making knowledge free, making knowledge publicly available. Why knowledge only to prepare students to feed the capitalist system? I I did a master's degree in community music, so I know intimately well knowledge that is not at all valued by the capitalist system, that does not enrich corporations or profit shares. It does not enrich the market, but enriches the human spirit. Is how I like to think of it. And I think we need to radically reprioritize how we as a society conceive of knowledge being valuable. I think, Nick, you made excellent points of like, people who could come up with clean energy solutions or come up with medical cures and things we desperately need. But there's also value and knowledge to be gained in all of the things that we massively devalue: arts, music, language, all of these things that enrich the human spirit and tell our stories and help us discover new ways of being people and relating to one another. We can explore that, we can uncover that, and that needs to be a shift. And I really, really value a lot of socialist organizations, especially Socialist Action, who do put an immense value on community and how knowledge benefits all, and putting that value and the value of knowledge towards all other people. Finally, Dustin Brown. First of all, I just want to say raising tuition for international students by 15% during a pandemic when it's already difficult enough to get here is absolutely criminally ridiculous. And I am deeply offended that that has happened. And I completely understand why they did that, but I still hate it. I mean, part of it's definitely racism. Like, that's fairly self-evident. And there's this idea that like, oh, international students, they come here, they get their education so that they can get a good job, and then they just go back home. And, if we lower their tuition, we're not benefiting at all from them coming here. And so it's seen as like this profitable industry, like, we're exporting well-educated students, but you need to pay for the privilege of having them. And that's just fundamentally not true. International students contribute massively to our country, to our society. They are massively, massively important in our communities. And we need to actively acknowledge that, and we need to make that value known. Students need to, like domestic students, need to stand up for and recognize the plight of international students, because it is all the same plight. If the university is screwing over international students, they're going to be screwing over domestic students too. Like, that's just how it's going to be. And we need to fight together. There needs to be solidarity, and there needs to be recognition from the wider community of just how much benefit we all get from international students being part of our communities.
Thank you, Emily. Before we move on, I'm going to go back to Sam to give her an opportunity to answer the third question. Samantha? Unmute yourself, dear.
I just wanted to touch on Dustin's question once I reread it, because I do have some experience through my work in my student life of about around organizing campaigns about making this information possible. I think the strongest thing is that none of this information is necessarily hidden, and we have like hard information to show people, and in these case students, how they're getting screwed over by these choices by the institution. Like, to have tuition go up 10 to 15% for this year, when things like a cost of living adjustment is capped at like 2%. I use these types of numbers to compare to it because I work with a union. But again, like I've said previously, students are workers, and this just shows that the priority is just not supporting the people in need. And I'm really proud to like show that or to note that workplaces that I'm involved with were directly part of the overturning of the SCI legislation. So it's all about not being afraid to take those risks. And like they went to court, people didn't think it would necessarily go in their favor, but it did. And it's just, I'll never forget being a student myself, and like institutions have the gall to raise those prices on us, and then a thing like the Toronto Sun Sunshine List would get published, and you see how much of my money is going towards these crazy wages for the professors, and it breaks your heart as a student because you just don't think it's fair. And when tuition is raised, like as we've said, in a pandemic year, how is it possible that this is required? And it's just, I just wanted to touch on it again because my heart is with you. The plight is so difficult for international students. I work with them directly, and they have so many more hoops and hurdles to jump. And as Emily said, it's just complete, utter, innate institutional racism, and it's abhorrent. And while we're all, as students, we're all struggling, we just need to make, like, it's all, again, about building the solidarity around it, and just knowing that building the stronger foundation and lobbying for change together is just the best thing that we can do right now.
Okay, thank you, Samantha. Now we're going to go back to Kurt, our producer, and get 3 more questions. And this time you will have up to 6 minutes each to answer. And the lineup will be Emily, Nick, and Samantha. Okay, Kurt?
Okay, our first question comes from Julius. He asked, what kind of work can Socialist Action do on campuses to build the free tuition movement? Our next question comes from Dinner with Franklin. Most people see education in instrumental terms alone. Is there any hope that education can again be seen as a good in itself, or even as a social good? Is it even a social good? And our last question for this round is coming from Ellen Ramsey, and she says, surely during the pandemic, the cost of education should come down, not go up due to online learning.
Okay, so you've heard the questions and seen them in the chat, and you have up to 6 minutes, and we'll start with Emily, then Nick, and then Samantha. Emily? Unmute yourself, Emily.
Sorry.
Thank you.
So first, responding to Julius's comment of what kind of work can SA do on campuses, I would say, so we had some success with this. My union, our PSAC Local 902 at Laurier, which is the newly formed TA union there, we actually started a petition, and we're doing some work to mobilize the student body along with the Graduate Students Association to advocate that summer tuition be dropped due to the related to the pandemic, as we were all adjusting back in the spring to this new way of being. And a lot of the fees that we would be paying, so, you know, technology fees, access fees to equipment and resources at the university are suddenly completely shuttered to us. So there was a lot of student uptake. We did negotiate for a reduction in spring tuition, and a lot of the ancillary fees were cut or capped, but still tuition had to be paid that term. However, the amount of student uptake was really, really promising. So I think Socialist Action could do a lot of advocacy virtually on campus, if you will, given that the majority of them are completely shuttered. I think that I mean, exactly that point, kind of tying in Ellen Ramsey's question that, like, yes, the costs of education should come down in a pandemic because we aren't accessing the in-person facilities. We don't have access to the majority of lab work. We don't have access to technology. We don't have, I can't even go to the freaking library, you know? So I'm paying for all of these opportunities that are completely closed to me. I do understand, of course, that, you know, professors, and there are still resources that need to be paid, but not as much as you're charging, not with the amount of facility fees that you're adding on top of that. So I think there are a lot of students who are going, why am I spending more on university that I'm taking from my basement room? This is ridiculous. So I think our newly formed Agitprop, or Agitation Propaganda Committee, has a lot of work that we can start on that front that I think is very, very promising. Because as I said before, there is an appetite, there is an awakening, there is a desire for change that the pandemic has really kind of dropped on our doorstep. There has been a collective awakening, the likes of which we haven't seen in a long time. To the second question, most people see education in instrumental terms alone. I think, yeah, and I mean, I have strong opinions on this because I think, you know, people keep asking, you know, what are you going to do with your degree? And I think, well, I'm learning for the sake of learning. I'm learning to expand my knowledge and that of those around me. And I'm working to contribute to a body of knowledge. And I think a lot of academics and people in university would say the same. Like, they really want to contribute to social good and expand our body of knowledge for the sake of doing so. I think part of it is the elitism of the academy that prevents us from holding that as more of a social value and a social good than it currently is, because, you know, there is the ivory tower. That is undeniable. There's a lot of gatekeeping around academia, and you'll hear it in a lot of academics' voices when you raise the idea of free tuition. They're like, well, you know, there's almost this undercurrent of, well, how will we keep the riffraff out? So there's a lot that academia needs to do to abolish the ivory tower, to, you know, get on the ground and to do the work of sharing knowledge and making knowledge publicly accessible, instead of just, you know, bandying about lofty terms within the confines of the academy that don't actually materially touch people's lives. So it's a both and, I think, and free education would go a really, really long way to contributing to knowledge as a public good and valuing knowledge for knowledge's sake.
Okay, thank you, Emily. Nick?
All right. So yeah, thanks for your questions, and I just want to extend, you know, my gratitude to the other comrades here this evening, my co-presenters, who have done a fantastic job in breaking down why we need free tuition. I forgot to do that in the last round. But I think to start with the first question is, what kind of work can Socialist Action do? I think expanding a campus presence, I think, is the first step in a very long road. But if you look at a more in a sort of a long-term plan, is you start by getting involved. You get to know people. You have a presence on campus, and then you. But Socialist Action alone cannot. We have to foster relationships with other groups on campus. And so when I was at Simon Fraser University, we had our teaching support staff union, which is RTA union, which was a radical leftist feminist union that was not part of QP or UFCW or sometimes the Steelworkers. And we organized a campaign called Tuition Freeze Now. And that we spent 9 months blitzing campus and attending Board of Governors meetings and with big posters. And we actually shut down the last Board of Governors meeting because we just refused to leave without and that, although we weren't able to freeze tuition and then eventually lower it, we were able to bring that topic to the forefront and make it a very prominent issue on campus. I think just working with other groups, like we worked with the graduate students, we worked with the undergraduate students, we worked with the society, different unions, different societies, profs, faculty members, you name it. We reached out to everybody, and it was this networking that I think Socialist Action has the advantage of being able to do. For the second question, I think exactly like a lot of people see education as, well, I'm going to university to get this degree, to get a job, to then get this specific job that I'm qualified for, because my name is on a diploma that says so. I think absolutely education should be seen as a societal good, right? That's how society progresses, right? Or that's how society advances beyond. That's how we got to the moon, right? Like we didn't have to go to the moon, but we did, right? And because we wanted to. So, and ultimately, at the end of the day, education is social good because, I mean, humans like to learn, right? That's what makes us human, is this desire to learn. I think it boils down to sort of like, if you want to borrow the Marxist term of use value and exchange value, right? If the use value goes up, then you can justify an exchange value. Whereas universities are trying to constantly push up this use value while to justify an increase in exchange value. But then that speaks to the commodification of education, which both Emily and Sam sort of spoke to earlier, so we don't need to cover those points again. But Ellen, your last point, I mean, absolutely, education be going down. I mean, I'm teaching students from this exact spot in my kitchen. And they're attending class every day from their basements or from their rooms or from a library or even at a bus stop. Like some students are just going somewhere else and taking part in class on their phone. So, I mean, they're not allowed to go to the gym. They're not allowed to go to the libraries. They're not allowed to go to take part in labs. So absolutely, why is education, especially when the University of Toronto has posted, like I mentioned, a $400 million surplus. The previous year, they posted a $505 million surplus. So you have to say, like, where's the money going? Like, but apparently the answer to that, if I read the financial reports, is that they're putting it into capital investments in real estate. University of Toronto is one of the biggest landowners in the city. So suddenly this enterprise is, my student dollars are feeding an enterprise of real estate is what's happened. And I think the university knows that in order to keep that up, it has to keep tuition levels where they are.
Okay, thank you, Nick. Samantha?
Thank you. So to start with Julius's question, to be honest, I can give like a very literal answer. Having worked for a student union, honestly, having like a presence on campus is good, but it's not necessarily going to be able to be socialist action that creates the group. And I think Nick touched on this a little bit. Like, find a student, find a leftist student, get them to like start up a new campus group, start student chapters. Like, there's a whole process to get these student groups approved, and it can take time. But the more support the student has, the more likely the group will get approved, and they'll even get funding from the student union. At least that's how it worked at Ryerson Students Union. But the appetite is there on these campuses. A lot of these campuses already have leftist groups, but that's a whole other conversation about leftist unity. And I think that's something that also needs to be worked on. And I think that's something we can do is take advantage of the appetite for this. Like, when people hear the word socialism, it's, especially in like this political climate right now, it's such a scary word, but it's just about making the information easily digestible and showing them like the hard facts and numbers. I've always felt that that's a great tool in campaigns, so I just can't emphasize that enough. In terms of education being a societal good, I can't deny that I see so many people just ragging on the world of post-secondary education as a place that just cultivates like like all like angry students and like people that's either you do a profitable degree or like you're like, you know, social justice warriors sort of stuff. But it's just like those people are just the loudest, and we can't listen to them, and we need to just shift away from this very like hardcore theory academia world and prioritize things like lived experience and like hands-on experiential learning. As a student who did in-class university theoretical learning, I was very lucky to also have to do field placements, which I always thought were extremely beneficial because I got kind of best of both worlds. And it's just making education not just like a factory setting, make it an engaging place that people want to be and like respect the experience more almost. To Ellen's question, as a student now at McMaster, like I read an article from the CBC that literally like made me laugh out loud because when this school year began, both like McMaster and Mohawk, like the university college duo that's out here in Hamilton, are just like, no, it's not going lower. You still have to pay the same. The experience is still there and you're still getting the same quality education. I absolutely respect the plight of the university workers. It's a scary world for them as well. They are having to potentially endanger themselves by having to go on campus, which is something that we're working with my work union stuff, protecting those employees and making sure they have a safe work environment. But like the students need that as well, which is why they've done the switch to online learning. But to me, it's just been such a huge experience in between a course that was already online versus something that had to adapt to the pandemic. So many universities didn't even confirm for students what was going to be online, if they were going to be allowed on campus. And there were so many questions going into this school year. It really showed how unprepared the sector was for this public health situation. And as much as I truly love the facilitators I've worked with at McMaster, our classes got plagued with technical difficulties. And that's hard to deal with when I'm trying to get my education and work with others sort of thing in this new remote sort of setting. So it's so disingenuous for universities to be saying stuff like that when the first semester's not even over and we're already getting the evidence that it's just not the same. So hopefully that's a little bit more like eye-opening for people who necessarily didn't necessarily see themselves as activists before, but just like I just hope those people find that there is a movement existing that they can come to, and like we're here and we just need to get together. It always comes down to solidarity and group power for me, and it's just about sharing our info and sort of campaigning and making sure everyone knows that this is wrong.
Okay, thank you, Samantha. Okay, so we're going to go back to our producer now. I understand we have 4 questions left, so we will take the 4, and you will have up to 6 minutes each to answer, a very strict 6 minutes, because we want to stay on time. And the lineup will be Nick, Samantha, and Emily, 6 minutes each. So Kurt, could you read the last 4 questions, please?
Okay, so our first question comes from Barry Weisletter, who asks, COVID-19 has had an enormous negative impact on students and teachers. What impact has the pandemic had on you? And what should we do to make higher education safe and more accessible to the working class? Dustin Brown asks, do student debt strikes or tuition strikes have strategic potential as tactics? What are some characteristics that successful student movements tend to share? Let's see. Okay, so JPL asks, SA and students should protest to gain attention and put pressure where needed, despite COVID situation. Do some actions are expected in 2021. So he's French, so I believe what he meant to ask is, are some actions expected in 2021? And our last question, because I think I lost where our last question was. Oh, our last question again from Barry Wiseletter, who asks, tuition fees are lowest in Quebec because students there conduct huge strikes every decade or so, together with profs and other workers. How can the CFS apply the lessons of Quebec?
Okay, so there's the 4 questions. You have up to 6 minutes to answer one or all 4. And we will begin with Nick, then Samantha, and then Emily.
Yeah, thanks for the questions, everyone. Barry, to get to maybe your question about COVID-19 impact on, yeah, it's a very loaded question, and we could spend all night talking about our higher education being accessible for the working class. But I think in a nutshell, I think for me, COVID-19, because I'm and my co-presenters will probably agree with this, is that because we have existed both as educators and students, we're doubly affected in a very specific way. And so for me, everything that I now do is online, and I'm in a position in my PhD program right now where I have to be basically just reading all the time. And a lot of these books are not available as digitized copies. So now I have to spend the extra time trying to find digital copies, if they even exist, and then trying to coordinate with a library when I can go pick up those books. If they're only available in print, if they're available at all. So I think that's a little bit of my personal experience. To make education safe and more accessible for the working class, I mean, I think safe you were referring to in a COVID environment, and I think it's being ultimately, to make it safe is being in a position that recognizes the lives that students have outside of universities, and that many working class students do not go to university because they have to be able to feed themselves, and they can't afford to pay tuition. And I think this circles back to the whole point of this evening is, this is why tuition should be free. To be, for accessibility, I think that's sort of it should not be a long-term project, but it's honestly just making it free, like hammering home the point of making it free. Dustin Brown says, you're a student. I think student debt strikes or tuition strikes, I think they have potential uses, but I think those groups will have to fundamentally ally with similar tactics used by rent strikes. And I think tuition strikes are only effective if you have above 80% participation. And I think getting in a university, as Sam has noted, is that despite there are socialists like ourselves, there are also very active right-wing student groups in the university that will fundamentally fight back against it. When we were doing SFU Tuition Freeze Now, we were trying to build a nationwide campaign, and we actually had students within our own university in the computer science department saying, well, no, actually they should be charging more so we have access to better equipment. So it's sort of a very finicky situation. But I think borrowing tactics from rent strikers would be a positive starting point. To the third question, are there expected actions? I think it's incredibly difficult to present, because what makes I think this will kind of follow into Barry's last question, is that what makes what makes an action or a political movement effective is its visibility, and it's very hard to be visible in an online environment because it's not like you can physically occupy a space. Right, it's not like a picket line or a position where students are, actively in meetings, or because meetings now are hidden by passcode. So only certain people are allowed within an email chain. And you don't, people can have their mics muted. People can be removed by the host. So it's actually become more anti-democratic in a lot of senses for potential job actions. And I think not only for student movement, but as the working class as a whole, right? Organizing in workspaces that are now have been transitioned to online has really thrown a wedge in organizing efforts in areas across the country. And JPL, to sort of get your point, I don't know of any job actions that are expected or actions expected for 2021. There should be, but that's difficult to say and varies on how people are feeling. I think, and the Barry's last question is, how can CFS apply the lessons of Quebec? I think as a historian, those are questions I ask myself all the time, is how can the working class apply lessons from the past? And that's up to, there's a certain idea behind that where you want to apply the lessons and you just want to take what happened in Quebec and apply it nationally, but that's a completely different scale. So I think there's a moment where people need to sit down and organize and really think, but ultimately be visible and achieve, concrete goals through direct action. But I yield my time. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Nick. Okay, we now go to Samantha.
Hello again. So to go through the questions, yes, like the pandemic has had an enormous negative impact on students and teachers. And in terms of on what it's affected, how it's affected me, I haven't been to my workplace since March, and it's pretty wild. And it's really made me acknowledge my privilege and the fact that that's possible for me. And it's really made me reflect on the treatment of frontline workers. What is the frontline now? Who is essential? These definitions are absolutely changing because, a stereotypical definition of that, you'd think of like a doctor and nurse. Absolutely, they provide us with essential services. But we also now look at the workers in our grocery stores, how, they were only labeled heroes for a little while, but to us, they're heroes every single day. They're putting themselves on the front line so the rest of us are able to go and purchase this sustenance and things that we need. And it's completely changed the entire workforce, I feel like, on so many levels. And every day we see examples of things that work and things that don't. Every place has plexiglass in between different aisles or like cash registers and stuff like that. We're going to see this change because, as we've seen, so many sectors were unprepared for this. They didn't have enough PPE. They didn't have funds or even protocol in place to protect their employees. Something I'm doing in my workplace right now, along with my coworkers. Well, I'm learning with my coworkers, but staff representatives are having to write up back to work memorandums and stuff like that, just because this is unprecedented, and it's just really showing how we're having to adapt as we go. In terms of student debt strikes and tuition strikes, I honestly think that kind of goes hand in hand with Barry's last question, in that CFS can apply the lessons of Quebec, because I think that the Quebec strike was so effective. Nick explained, you need a large amount of participation, which is something that they definitely got. They clearly campaigned on the fact that their tuition was going to be raised by 75%, and that's a terrifying number. They were able to demonstrate that, real, just the real danger of setting that precedent. And they didn't give up. That was another thing. They were dedicated to their cause, and it went on for months. And another thing is, you saw that by the end, it's not just students that were those main students involved. They had gotten more student participation, and faculty was participating because they realized how it was such an unfair treatment to the students. So it's the how I mentioned before, like the student worker solidarity. That's something you have to build. It's not just with students. It's with the folks that work at the university as well. And with JP's question, like I would expect, they can't not happen. These types of actions. The way things are going, I would only expect more, because these types of not aggressive, but just like powerful actions are what is getting noticed. And as much as people are like, oh, strikes are so disruptive, that's the point. And that's just what needs to be driven home. And I think there's too much uncertainty. Students can't go on not knowing how the university is going to support them going forward, because we don't know when the pandemic's going to end. So if they want answers, then I do think things like strikes are what need to happen. And we need the support of everyone on campus, not just the students.
Okay, thank you, Samantha. Emily?
Hello, yes. So thank you for these questions. And yeah, as Nick said, like the impacts of COVID-19 on students and teachers, for those of us in graduate school or who do this work, like we really get the double whammy of both. I have been really, really fortunate in that the impact of the pandemic on myself has been minimal, aside from the fact that I can no longer work. But for so many of my colleagues, everything has been scuppered. And one of my colleagues was doing a project working with seniors in seniors' homes. And not only was her entire project canceled, but all of her funding was canceled as well. So she won't have a chance to resume that project at all. So I guess that's an issue with, making research and making education more accessible, is that, we're suddenly having the rug pulled out from under us on so many fronts. And part of the issue, I mean, many people are saying in some ways, online university or Zoom university is more accessible. But in other ways, it's really not. Being at home and requiring a computer and stable internet access and multiple devices to access all of the material and specific materials requirements that you have to purchase for yourself, rather than going to a library or a technology lab to access. Education has become much more inaccessible to the working class for all of those reasons, in addition to many universities increasing tuition. Regarding the question of student debt strikes or tuition strikes, I think they do have potential as tactics. I agree. We need to borrow from the renters union and rent strikes, and acknowledge the danger that is present in those of massive interests, of being denied access to education, and of all of those compounding risks, and finding ways to build solidarity outside of the student body. So building solidarity with faculty who are being, kept in the dark and led astray and mistreated during this whole process, and not receiving adequate compensation, having their pay cut in some instances, especially for adjunct professors. I think, and that's the characteristic of successful student movements, is it goes beyond just the students, but it also lets every student know what's at stake. one of my other colleagues mentioned, the struggle of getting some students on board. I remember talking to an engineering student, when we were doing the union campaign, and I said, "Would you be interested in joining the union?" And he said, "Nope, I'm okay. They pay me very well and treat me very well, and I don't care." I was like, great. You don't care about the well-being of any of the rest of your colleagues at the university. And he said, "Nope." It's like, cool. Not realizing necessarily how the mistreatment of some students paves the way for the mistreatment of all, no matter how well funded your faculty is. There are always things that can change. Actions expected in 2021. I think, the rug has been pulled out from under all of us, and we are figuring out ways to react and to mobilize effectively in this current moment. And there is some efficacy with online actions, but in-person actions just can't happen right now, especially with universities, because people are away. Everyone's stayed home. If they don't need to go to campus for labs and things like that, everyone's stayed home. So getting people together in a physical location just is not possible right now, not in any ways to be able to affect a meaningful action. Whether or not that will change in 2021, I hope, but as long as universities remain primarily virtual, I think the actions will be primarily virtual as well. That is not to say that they cannot be effective. It just means that they won't have the same visibility. Regarding how the CFS can apply lessons that we've learned from Quebec, the student strike in Quebec was an incredibly radical movement. It was led by radical leftist students, and they involved every single level of the students. And also the issue was affecting all students equally, all at once. And it was a massive, massive thing that was being changed really, really unfairly. And it set a massive precedent. But the tactics they engaged in were radical. They caused immense disruption in the city beyond just the university. They caused massive disruption in the city of Montreal and in Quebec, that forced the involvement of everything beyond just the university administration and the faculty. Everyone else had to get involved, and everyone else had to pay attention to what was going on. I think that's about it. I'll yield my time here, but yeah, we can engage in radical tactics. We just need to be clever with how we're strategizing in this current day and age.
Thank you, Emily. Okay, folks, we are nearing the end of our program. Special thanks to Emily, Samantha, and Nick, to our producer, Kurt Young in Mississauga, and everyone who participated in tonight's conversation. Please consider buying a subscription to Socialist Action newspaper, only $25 for 1 year, delivered to your door. To fill out the form, just visit our website, www.socialistaction.ca. That's www.socialistaction.ca. If you would like to talk to us about joining SA, write to socialistactioncanada@gmail.com. or just call us 647-986-1917. And once again, if you like the show, please subscribe to the Socialist Action YouTube channel. Now, the next essay webcast is on Thursday, October the 22nd at 7 p.m. Rosa Luxemburg and the Revolutionary Party, with Stephen Ellis, veteran socialist, plus discussants John Riddell, author of several books on the Communist International in the 1920s, and Emery Sayan, a university history student based in Edmonton. For the details, just visit www.socialistaction.ca. In the meantime, please stay safe, stay healthy, and be active. Bye.